Welcome to episode 210 of the Disorganized Wizards Club podcast. My name is Alex, and I'm joined by my one co-host, Cam. How you doing?
Oh, pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good. And it's
roomy in here. There's a lot of free space in this Discord call.
Just Cam this week. Adam's taking a break from the show for a little bit. Got a lot going on in his life with work and travel, so he's going to be stepping out for a bit. So just Cam and I again. But I think it was just me and you all last year in December as well, right? This is usually a yearly thing we do, I think.
Yeah, because when things were normal, Adam would actually, maybe it was 2 years ago, but when things were normal, Adam would travel home for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
I think 2 years ago, we did the show over Christmas, just the two of us. Maybe we had a couple guests.
Yeah.
But last year, Adam was Skyping in, right?
I feel like he still missed a couple. I could be wrong.
Yeah, maybe
though.
He had family events going on or something. But
anyway, my point was it's not something new for it to just be two of us in December.
Yeah, you're still in good hands.
Exactly.
It'll still be a good show.
We are a pair of Ottawa-based Magic players here to help you and ourselves get better at Magic, specifically by talking about decks and tournaments this week.
Oh, yeah.
Zendikar Rising Championship.
That was a nice shake-up to the intro.
Yeah.
Got the same sort of feel, the same kind of energy, but it's fresh.
Exactly. So
it's like when Subway offers the meatball sub, but on a different type of bread. Basically the same thing, but everyone gets excited.
I never really thought about it that way. It's a good.
Yeah, Subway doesn't really ever offer different products. I don't think any fast food restaurant ever does, but everyone gets stoked when they're like, we put this slightly different ingredient with this other ingredient that's normal.
Yeah. And
we give it a fancy name.
I always do get excited when Subway brings the pulled pork sandwich back. And let's be honest here. It's not great pulled pork, but it's different. So it's good.
Yeah, it's just novel.
Exactly. Hashtag not sponsored. But Subway, if you wanna sponsor us, my DMs are open. But let's talk about our actual sponsor of the show, wizardtower.com, your source for Magic singles. We've got some great holiday deals up on their website, wizardtower.com, so definitely check them out. If you live in Canada, want you get your hands on some good MTG or gaming goodies.
Yeah, and if you're looking for something that, has that familiar feel, but is somewhat new, Kaldheim spoilers will be starting soon, and the Wizard Tower will have pre-orders.
Exactly. And before we get into the content, also just got to shout out our website, dwc.gg, your home for all the DWC content. You can find links to our Patreon, our Twitch, our YouTube. It's all there. Putting a little bit more work into YouTube as of late. So if you want to check out that stuff, maybe throw us a sub, like a couple of our videos. It all helps. We really appreciate it. It's youtube.com/The Disorganized Wizards Club. We've got actually an exciting episode today. We're going to be doing something a little bit different with a case study, taking a look at mana bases, which we'll be getting into a little bit later. And you'll be able to follow along with the case studies. We'll be making a post along with this episode on our Twitter. I'll run through all that later. And there will also be a YouTube video to accompany it, so you can follow along with us and actually see what we're talking about.
It's going to be like those old arts and crafts shows.
Yeah.
Or I guess kind of like what Bob Ross did, right? Like the follow along, watch us build something.
Exactly,
What was the was it from French Canada? Art Attack? Where the guy would make
I used to watch Art Attack all the time when I was little.
Yeah, I did. A lot.
Art Attack.
Yeah, just like weird, like do-it-yourself sculptures. Or he'd make those huge, pictures that you can see, like, I don't know, from a helicopter or something by just laying stuff on the ground.
Exactly, yeah. It was a whole thing where he would start, putting stuff on the ground or painting something and make it out of, I don't know, just stuff you would find around the house. And it would zoom out for an overhead shot at the end of it, and it would be a picture of something. I remember that very vividly. I used to literally watch that show whenever I could when I was little.
But here's my follow-up question to you and anyone listening who remembers. Despite these shows having the vibe of like you should follow along, did anyone actually ever do the crafts? I just watched.
No, yeah, I just watched. Yeah. I can't remember what channel it was, but it was always Art Attack. It was Zaboomafoo. And it was this other show. I think it was called Zoom. Was it Zoom?
I don't remember Zoom.
I can picture the show, but I can't remember what actually happened. It was always just a bunch of random stuff. I think it was Zoom. But anyway, I used to watch those because I'm pretty sure they were all on the same channel, so you would watch them in sequence.
Yeah, I basically watched like 3 channels when I was a kid. There was like YTV.
Oh yeah, YTV for sure.
The Family Channel sometimes, and I feel like there's another one I'm forgetting.
Yeah.
Nickelodeon, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe. I can't remember what the channel was that I'm talking about, but that was definitely one of them. But all kids content. Anyway, let's talk about...
If you want to follow along with our arts and crafts,
yeah,
stay tuned until the end of the episode.
Yeah, we'll get to that when we get there. But let's start off by talking about the Zendikar Rising Championship. Taken down by a Scot, Brad Barclay, making a run in Historic, Blue-White Control, and Blue-Black Control in Standard. Absolutely crushed. 12-0 run across all the Historic rounds. That includes the top 8 in Historic. I actually have his... Let's take a quick look at... I don't know what he did in Standard. It must be X3. X3 in Standard, since he never lost in Historic, obviously. So really good run. And kind of coming completely out of left field. I don't think Blue-White Control was really on anybody's radar, to be honest.
Definitely was not on mine. And it's the type of archetype that you'd assume gets pushed out by Uro. Like a 1-for-1 control deck. Just, you've seen these strategies kind of get pushed out by just the constant recursion from Uro, the inability to really efficiently interact with Hydroid Crisis, the punishing play against Nissa, and the narrow answers required. But this take of Blue-White ended up doing well. Grafdigger's Cage's main to answer the Uro problem. A lot of cast outs to answer, Uro, if it gets escaped, it's a nice exile. I can answer Nissa pretty effectively. So yeah, an interesting take on control, and did very well for him.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't overlook either the 2 Narsets in the main and the 2 in the sideboard. Narset has the ability to just completely shut down the Uro Hydroid Crisis decks if they're able to stick it early and protect it at all. So
yeah, that's something we've been seeing in the mirrors as well. Like Narset main deck was common among the 4-color midrange decks and the Sultai midrange decks. And we saw plenty of times on coverage someone like stick a Narset and the other person just die because they only have Uros and Crisis in their hand.
Yeah. I mean, as the Blue-White Control player playing against something like Sultai or 4-color, if you're able to sneak that Narset in early and then you just counter the Nissa, what are they supposed to do? It's just so hard for them to claw back into the game. Their normal card advantage spells don't work anymore.
Yeah, so long as you can stop the Nissa from removing the Narset and you can protect against that card, everything else they have becomes really clunky.
Yeah.
Like they're just sorcery speed creatures with note haste that's it. They're just vanilla creatures.
Yeah. Taking a look at Brad's run through the event. He played against a lot of 4-color midrange in Historic. Let's take a look for the Swiss. He played it against it 1, 2, Sultai. I'll count Sultai as that. So 3, 4. Yeah, 4 times in the Swiss. And then I think he beat it a few more times in the top 8. I don't actually have the bracket pulled up in front of me, but it would make sense as the top 8 was mostly 4-color midrange, right?
Yeah, his run through top 8 was winning against 4-color midrange, then winning against 4-color midrange, and then winning against goblins twice in a row.
Yeah. The top 8 it was Historic, and there were 4 4-color midrange decks and 2 Sultai midrange decks, capped off by Goblins and Azorius Control. And funny enough, Goblins and Azorius Control were the 2 decks left standing at the finals. So it ran through the midrange field. And I'm not actually surprised to see that either, because both of these lists seemed like they had the midrange decks in mind. I think specifically, for an example, if you look at Andrea Mengucci, in Historic, I think he went 9-3 across the entire weekend, and all 3 of his losses were to Autumn Burchett on Goblins. So he went X and Autumn in the event, and I think these decks were just primed to beat these mid-range decks that while some of them thought they were accounting for goblins, at the end of the day, they weren't really. Outside of one deck in particular, which we'll talk about, 4-color midrange from Tomas Pokorny. I really like his innovation on the strategy for specifically goblins, but everyone else just didn't seem quite too prepared for it. And Autumn's tech of adding Mind Stone and Herald's Horn to the main deck really gave the Goblins deck a kind of an extra axis to fight on Sultai against Sultai and 4-color, because you're no longer just all in on the Muxus plan, which I think these decks were prepared for. Everyone has Muxus, in top of mind. You're ready to fight that game plan. But when all of a sudden you have something like Herald's Horn in game one and are able to grind, you're going to build the card advantage, and you're going to kill them with your other threats as well. And not all of the decks can really account for both game plans.
Yeah, we saw that a few times on coverage. Autumn would, tank for a bit at the beginning of their turn, and then, I assume most people watching would be assuming, maybe they're going to go get a Muxus, and commentary would be talking about how they're going to set up for Muxus, and instead they'd go get like a Krenko and a Goblin War Chief, and like make a bunch of tokens, and just kill their opponent that way. And so, very, very fluent in the Goblins deck, very aware of all the different possible lines to victory, and not just playing it as this like all-in linear strategy, but as a much more flexible, like grindy deck with combo potential in it.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, Herald's Horn is not a new card for the archetype. Most lists for a while now have been playing 3 or 4 copies in their sideboard, but it hadn't been moved to the main deck until just now. And after seeing Autumn just completely run the tables in this event and how good it looked for this deck in game one, I think this is going to be pretty stock going forward.
Yeah, that's fair to say. But of course, I mean, with all adjustments, you can take this with a grain of salt, perhaps. We've definitely seen in the past that innovations to decks which do well at, say, Pro Tours, whatever, the Zendikar Rising Championship, the equivalent of these big premier tournaments, sometimes they stick. Other times they ended up being like very good, narrow metagame calls, and they never really solidify themselves in ladder or in other events. So it'll be interesting to see how this turns out, because despite Autumn's run, the Goblin players overall didn't do amazing. They only had like about a 45% win rate over the tournament. I'm not sure if there even were other Goblin players at the top tables other than Autumn. Of course, all those results are skewed by standard, but Autumn's performance was definitely an outlier. And I mean, this could be due to a few things. It could be due to, as I said, Autumn's like very skillful piloting of the deck. Maybe other people were playing it slightly incorrectly, trying to be more all in, and that's the adaptation that needs to stick more so than the Herald's Horn. Or maybe it was just due to a string of good matchups for Autumn that other Goblin players didn't get to benefit from. Hard to say, but Goblins over the weekend kind of shot a bit low. So maybe people don't put as much stock into this minor tweak as we expect. Hard to say, but it's definitely something to keep in mind if you're playing a lot of Sultai on ladder.
Yeah, looking quickly through the results, Emma Handy played the same 75. She went 3-4 with the list in Historic. In the Swiss, both Autumn and Emma Handy lost to Tomas Pokorny, which is actually interesting because I already briefly mentioned his list and why I liked it. I haven't talked about why I liked it yet, but we'll circle back to that. Looks like they lost to Emma lost to Rakdos Sacrifice, and then 4-color midrange from Tomas, and lost to. Okay, so the 3-4, Emma didn't make day 2. 3-4 was just 3 rounds of Historic and 4 rounds of Standard. So Emma went 1-2 in the first 3 rounds of Historic. Lost to Rakdos Sac and 4-color midrange, and then beat 4-color midrange. But the 4-color midrange they beat is pretty different from Tomas's list. So let's actually cycle to his list, since we've mentioned it a little bit about already.
Yeah, what is this big innovation?
So big thing number 1, no Yasharns in the main deck. 2 copies of Mythos of Nethroi. So if you look across all the other 4-color mid-range decks in this top 8, specifically if we look at like Brad Nelson and Mengucci, I think they played the same 75. Neither of those guys played Mythos of Nethroi, and neither of those guys have main deck answers to a Herald's Horn. So if one of those resolves early, it's going to be tough to keep up on that card advantage that card can accrue. Second, 3 Tocatli Honor Guard in the sideboard, which is an absolute house versus goblins. And it really kind of just only makes you have to worry about Krenko, which is pretty easy to manage if that's really all you're worried about. So not only does he have ways to kill the Herald's Horn, but he also has Tocatli Honor Guards to shut down Muxus in game 2 and 3, while not simultaneously shutting down your Uro plan, whereas, traditionally decks would go to like Grafdigger's Cage or something like that.
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
So I really do think Tocatli Honor Guard is the truth and is probably going to be stock for sideboards of 4-color mid-range going forward. Also, Tomas played 1 copy of Narset in the main deck as a nod to the mirror, which I also really like as well. The one thing I don't like about his deck is 3 Fatal Push in the main. I'm actually not convinced that Fatal Push is that spectacular. And I'd probably only play like 1 or 2 copies. Maybe 1, to be real. I think you'd much rather have something like Eliminate instead as ways to kill Narset. And just like, because Fatal Push, majority of the time in this deck, it's really just killing a 1 or 2 cost creature. So Eliminate also fills that role as well. So
yeah, that makes sense.
I
kind of like that, going a bit bigger on removal in general to diversify what you can answer, because like the threats in the format are becoming a bit more diverse. Like you have to answer Narsets, you have to answer these artifacts now. And Mythos of Nethroi looked good every time I saw it on coverage. Picking off Narsets, picking off Nithas, picking off, etc. And I think that's probably also why Blue-White maybe had a pretty good time, is that Cast Out is like equally versatile in what it can answer. And we saw against Goblins a lot of Herald's Horn getting cast out, and then, a couple dead draws from the Goblins player giving Blue-White the time they need, which perhaps they wouldn't have had with the Herald's Horn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To circle back to Brad and Mengucci's list, by the way, the one thing I do really, really like about their list is the 1 Doom Whisperer in the sideboard for the mirror matches. Because not only does this card dodge Gust, it dodges pretty much, I think, all of the removal that you could have outside of, those noted Mythos of Nethrois that Tomas had, but they didn't. But yeah, Doom Whisperer, and also you untap with that thing, like you can do so much. You can find a removal spell. If you have any, life to work with, you can dig towards a removal spell you need, the Nissa you need. You can fill your graveyard to escape an Uro. You can dig to the Hydroid Craces. It actually does a lot. And it looked really, really good.
Kind of crazy for a while there that like 3, sometimes even 4 Aether Gusts main was becoming the norm in some Sultai lists, and people just kept playing green cards.
Yeah.
Elder Gargaroths, whatever. They just kept doing it. They just, okay.
Yeah. And like Doom Whisper, like not only does it do all those things about filling your graveyard, digging towards your spells, but it also just flies over the Nissa lands to pressure Nissa. It flies over the ground, the Uros to kill a Narset. It actually does so much. So I think the Doom Whisper is another card that we're going to see be pretty mainstay in the sideboards for Sultai going forward. And maybe the Sultai decks and 4-color decks have to keep that card in mind for post-board games and make sure they have ways to kill it.
Yeah, that's a sweet inclusion.
Yeah.
Thinking about those Tocatli Honor Guards, you said they don't stop your Uros. And I guess they stop the card draw trigger, but I also forgot that they'll play well on like the front half of Uro. They stop the sack trigger. You just get 3-mana 6/6s, which against Goblins is the sort of clock/blocker early you need.
Yeah, I mean, cool. if you like growth spiraled on turn 2 and then on, turn 4, you just go Honor Guard Uro against Goblins. Like that's a pretty good sequence, I'd say. And it's not like
you still get the attack triggers. That's nuts.
And for something like the Arena Open this weekend, an event that's not open deck list, maybe your opponent doesn't have any way to deal with an Honor Guard in game 2 or 3 because they've sideboarded out the Gem Palm Incinerators, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and you're not going to be bringing like a Braid in versus Sultai midrange or 4-color midrange, right? So it's pretty realistic that those Honor Guards get to stick around for a while and do some good work. So,
yeah, the only thing Goblins would, I think, really want to abrade is Grafdigger's Cages, and they usually lean on Goblin Crater Maker for that, which isn't good enough versus the Honor Guard.
Yeah, it doesn't deal with Honor Guard. So, well, we'll see if players make these adjustments going forward. But yeah, I really, really liked Thomas Pokorny's list, and I like some of these card choices. So I wouldn't be surprised to see something similar to his 75 perform really well this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I like story of the tournament, looking at the win rates. So 4-color midrange was the most played deck in the field. And outside, I know Dimir Control, looking at this win rate matrix, has a higher win rate than it, but we're talking about 4 Dimir Control decks versus 37 4-color midrange decks. Dimir Control had 60% win rate, and then 4-color midrange had 57.6. So like a little bit more of a realistic win rate when looking at the 4-color data. So I'm just going to say 4-color midrange was the best performing historic deck across the weekend, while also being the most played. So like, you would think being the most played, it's going to kind of push that win rate more towards 50%. But also you have to consider that, hey, it's the most played deck because a lot of people consider it the best deck in the format as well. So that's going to shoot the win rate up. So seeing such a good performance, I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say right now that 4-color midrange is the best deck in historic. And while Goblins and Blue-White were able to take advantage of it in the top 8, I think the iterations and the adaptations that we saw from Tomas already are going to be adopted across these other decks. And then there's some pretty easy changes you can make from 4-color midrange to shore up your matchup against Blue-White Control, right? Like, for example, let's take a look at Manguchi's list. If I want to beat Blue-White Control, I'm going to turn these Essence Scatters into either negates in the main deck, or you could turn them into even like Tail's End. And then you get to catch a lot of matchups, right? It's good versus Goblins. You can counter the Muxus.
Mm-hmm.
Good versus Blue-White, can counter Teferis.
I think a big thing against Blue-White is that it can hit Shark Typhoon cycles as well, which are otherwise pretty hard to interact with.
Yeah, like Tail's End, I think, is actually criminally underplayed in blue decks and standard, and non-standard and historic. And I would like to see more people pick that card up. I actually think it's really good. So yeah, you can make that easy switch with the Essence Scatters, right? Play maybe one less Fatal Push, one more Eliminate. The Yasharns in your main deck can be swapped out to the Mythos of Nethroi, and then add Thought Distortion to your sideboard. And then all of a sudden, I'm feeling pretty good about my Blue-White Control matchup, right? Few small tweaks.
For sure.
So, I mean, that something similar to all those changes is probably what I would be doing if I was playing in the Arena Open, which I will be. I will be playing in the Arena Open. I'm most likely going to play 4-color midrange.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd do as well. One of the versions with Narset main, probably taking a nod from these changes we've talked about. But yeah. I don't know if I'm actually going to play. I haven't actually played in one yet.
I've always been busy for the first day, but I'm not busy this time, so I actually have time. I don't have any gold saved up, so I'll have to spend some gems, but you can play best of 3 on day 1. It's no longer just best of 1, so probably going to give it a go.
Cool.
Yeah,
I'll see. But yeah, 4-color, I'd bring a 4-color deck. It's just, as much as I said last week that I wouldn't want to play it because I'm tired of playing with and against Nissas, it just continues to show like good performance in the face of a format fighting against it, and it shows its ability to adapt. And I mean, Nissa's just feels kind of crazy not to play Nissa. She's so strong.
Yeah, Nissa Uro Growth Spiral Crisis. I mean, kind of at this point, You'd have to show me something really new and exciting to get me away from these cards in historic, or just ban something, right?
That'd do it. That would make me stop playing.
Yeah, I mean, if they banned Duro, I'd have to rethink what I'm doing. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts there. The event also was standard for the Zendikar Rising Championship. And looking at the win rates for just that event, Dimir Rogues performed the best. 55% win rate, followed closely by Esper Doom at 54. Gruul Aggro coming in at that clean 50% win rate.
Yeah, I mean, that's 50% from Gruul Aggro, I guess, is kind of what we expected, right? Like, it's the deck of the format, has game everywhere, but everyone's targeting it. So that makes sense. Dimir Rogues, yeah, cool. There were a few interesting games on coverage played by Paulo Vito Damir de Rosa on Dimir Rogues. There was one really weird one that we co-streamed on Friday where he just... Was it when we co-streamed on Friday? Where he just like wasn't casting any of the creatures in his hand for like a really long time. Just kind of like playing land go.
Yeah, that was Friday.
Still not exactly sure what his plan was there, but it's a cool one to go check out if you want to maybe see some of the alternate ways this deck could be played. But yeah, was the Luris version more popular than the Zerasan version? Do we have those stats?
Can't actually tell from this.
Because I saw both on coverage. Both looked good.
Yeah. Looking at the copy of Dimir in the top 8 from Luca Magni, it's a Zerasan version. Paulo Vitor finished 9th, and his version is a Ruin Crab Luris version. And then Strosky is the next closest at 11th, and he played a Ruin Crab Luris version. Both of those I think they work together, both of them on 3 of One Mind, which is actually something you brought to DWC Versus the other week. And I mean, it looked pretty good from the games I saw in coverage this weekend. And it looked pretty good when you played it as well.
Yeah, that's a card that I really like, especially, well, I mean, I think both versions can pick it up pretty easily. So it's a cool inclusion in these Rogues decks, just giving them a bit more card advantage because, I mean, your threats are kind of small. So being able to just have a few more of them really helps you against a lot of these matchups.
Yeah. It's interesting to look because we also have a win rate matrix for Standard from the past week that includes not only the Zendikar Rising Championship, but also all the SCG events. And if you take a look at that, you have a bit of a different outlook on the metagame. Dimir Rogues comes in just under 50%, whereas Gruul and Esper Doom are right up top there. So obviously, the metagame at the Zendikar Rising Championship is different than all the other events. I think there's something to say for, the average player skill level at the Zendikar Rising Championship versus the average player skill level across every other event that happened, including this matrix. Like maybe there's something interesting to talk about there, but
yeah, I mean, even that game I was just talking about where I don't quite understand what Paulo was going for. Like it might just be that the Rogues decks have a few more minor intricacies in them that these good players who have a lot of experience with the deck can exploit that maybe other players are missing. I don't know. I don't like to talk so much about like how amazing the pro players are and how they do things that no one else can do. But I mean, if you practice enough with a deck, you'll see these like narrow lines that people who are maybe just picking something up or who don't play all the time might not see. So it might be that Rogues is just has a few more intricacies than something like Gruul Aggro, but even Gruul Aggro, I think, has more intricacy to it than people may assume. I mean, a lot of Autumn's games are sort of, I think, emblematic of that. Perfectly like balancing when to attack, when not to attack, how to deploy their threats. So yeah, who knows? Maybe just in an open field, Gruul Aggro is a bit more consistently powerful than Rogues, which takes a bit more work.
Yeah.
Maybe the split of these Rogues decks is different. Maybe it actually is the Luris version that's better, and one of these open ones are not Luris. Hard to say.
Yeah. If you take a look at the SCG Championship from the Sunday, it was taken down by Esper Doom. And Esper Doom is the one consistent point of data across both these matrices, sitting at 54% in both of them. So maybe the takeaway here is that Esper Doom was slept on and that it's maybe people should get back on that deck now. Because if you look at the winning deck list from this event from Tien, it looks like he just crushed Gruul and Mono Green Food through the whole event.
Yeah, that's not... I think we had talked about this before, right? Like, it kind of makes sense that Doom Foretold is good in those matchups. Just spot removal and an Abyss to put them under.
Yeah. I think Tien's list is exactly what Mengucci played as well in the Zendikar Rising Championship. Obviously, he top-aided, so he had a pretty good performance there with it as well.
I mean, yeah. There's some variations in the numbers between standard events, but none of this is super surprising to me. It's kind of... Really, that's the takeaway I have from the whole weekend, both historic and standard. The decks that were staples of the format that we expected to show up did show up, and they performed about as well as we expected, and the oddball, outlier, innovative strategies outside like one or two notable exceptions didn't really stand up to the meta decks.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we spent a lot of time talking about the Zendikar Rising Championship. Let's segue here into our case study. So doing something a little bit different this week.
We're experimenting.
So both of us received a couple questions about mana bases and specifically how we approach building them over the past week. So we thought it would be interesting to run through a case study with two decks that we've thrown together quickly for historic that are just cards without the mana base. So we have both of these lists are going to be posted on our Twitter at DWC Podcast 1. I'll link them in the show notes for this episode. We're also going to be posting a video to our YouTube channel where you can run through this case study with us to see how we went about building the mana bases for this deck. So if you want to pull up our Twitter page right now at DWC Podcast 1, find a tweet with these two deck lists. And then the whole point of this is for you yourself, pause the episode, build a mana base yourself, and then you can listen to us go through it on the podcast or watch us go through it on YouTube and then compare where we both ended up at the end of things.
This happens a lot on like YouTube channels that feature puzzles. I'm not sure if anyone listening is into the puzzle community or but either physical puzzles or like mental puzzles, math puzzles I sometimes watch. This also happens in like some chess YouTube channels where they'll like stop at some point in a game they're covering and they'll be like, oh, pause the video and see if you can find the winning move for black. So spoiler break, pause the episode, come up with a mana base. Warning though, I know a lot of people listen to this on their drive or their commute. Perhaps maybe not so much a thing at the moment, but if you are driving, please don't try and build a mana base.
Yeah. You can follow along with the case study or you can listen to us go through it and then try and build a mana base yourself based on what we talk about. But to get the most out of this, you can watch us go through it on YouTube, pull up our deck list from the YouTube video or from our Twitter page, build the mana base yourself, and then listen to us run through it. So,
other caveat, no promises that these decks are actually good.
Yeah. The point of throwing these decks weren't to have, top tier performing decks in historic. It was mostly for a thought experiment to throw some weird mana costs into both decks to make it not as straightforward for building the mana base. Both of these decks are 3 colors. We have a Mardu God Pharaoh's Gift deck, and then we have a teamer. It's called Bootleg Chandra. It's really a teamer Gear Hulk deck.
Yeah.
So
this one's sweet. I'll explain it more when we get into it. But I guess before we jump in, some like general notes about building mana bases. For most decks, like 1 and 2 color decks, I think it's not that hard. 1 color decks, it's basically just, do I want utility lands or not? And things like, if you're playing goblins, like the Castle Empress, they're like a free inclusion. Maybe you want a Field of Ruin. A Phyrexian Tower is sort of an innovation, but those mana bases are pretty straightforward. 2 color decks as well. You just sort of play all the duels you can with considerations for how many tap lands you can afford to play. And if you need any utility lands. So the real challenge is in 3 color decks. So both of these are 3 color. And there, the sort of golden standard reference is an article by Frank Karsten, mathematician member of the Magic community, who worked out a lot of the numbers needed to have like reasonably probable chances of hitting certain mana costs on time. And whether you learn these from the Frank Carson article or you sort of just pick them up by playing and experimenting, they're sort of now the go-to for most people. So you can reference this article. Some examples from it. If you need to have a colored source on turn 1 to play something like Llanowar Elf, then you should have 14 untapped sources of that color. And then, most of the time you'll be able to have like untapped green on turn 1, play Llanowar Elf. If you need a double color on 3, so say your control, and you need to cast Neutralize or Cancel or whatever, you should have 18 blue sources. If you need to, say, Wrath on 4, and you need 2 colored sources on turn 4, you only need 16 sources. Maybe you need to cast some like Planeswalker that's like 4 generic and a red. Then you only need 9 red sources. And so these numbers are all there. You can go reference them. And so most of really building a mana base, at least the way I approach it, is usually I just add in like 4 of every reasonable duel I think I might want to play. And then count through my actual mana requirements and adjust to match these numbers. And then once I've reached there, then I make adjustments between tapped, untapped, maybe fitting in a utility land, etc. Yeah. I'm not sure if you approach it similarly.
Yeah, of course, how you approach the mana base is going to first off depend on the format and what dual lanes you have access to. Obviously, in a format like Standard, which is constantly rotating, you're going to have better mana in some formats for specific color pairings, and you're going to have worse mana at different points in time, right? So first off, if we're kind of just considering general rules of thumb, just look at what you have access to you, and then you can kind of base what is doable and what isn't based on your card choices for your deck, based on what the sources are, right? So if in some formats, it could be realistic to be more greedy with your mana base because you have a lot more duels to work with. In some formats, you may only have access to 1 duel, and then, how realistic is it for me? Like if I'm building a green-black deck and I have only 1 dual land, is it realistic for me to be building a deck where I have, black on turn 2 and then green on turn 3, right? And this is all going to play into what your card choices are, etc. So we wanted to choose Historic specifically for the case study here because you have tons of options right now. And it's a little more, I guess, complicated than it would be for building in a fetch land format, because fetch land formats just kind of make it easy because your mana is always perfect because of fetch lands.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say I agree with you. Step 1, if I'm building, a Mardu deck, since we're talking about one for the case study, I would just kind of like look at all of the possible dual lands I have in those exact 3 color pairings, and then add 4 of everything, and then just kind of work my way down and around based on what my color requirements actually are.
And I mean, so you mentioned fetch lands in like a fetch land format. Most fetch land formats now are like fetch lands alongside fetchable dual lands. And so these same principles still apply. You still should be counting how many color requirements you have, making sure you have the right number of sources. It's just that when you can fetch duels, your fetch lands become like sometimes 5 color sources, sometimes 4 colors, sometimes all 3. And so they're very dense on how many colors they could provide. And so it makes it very easy to hit all these requirements.
Exactly, yeah. For example, if we're looking at a green-black deck, my Overgrown Tomb is only ever two color sources, right? It's only ever black, green. But if I'm looking at a Verdant Catacombs, it could be 5, right? It could be anything.
Yeah,
so,
depending on which other black and green duels you have.
So yeah, when you're building your Golgari mana base or an Abzan mana base, that 1 dual land counts as 3 colors of sources, whereas the Overgrown Tomb would only count as 2, right? So that's why it just is infinitely easier to build functional mana bases in those fetch land formats.
But there was a while in Standard, the most recent Standard that had fetch lands. Well, not the most recent, I guess. Anyway, when Khans of Tarkir first came out, before Battle for Zendikar, there weren't fetchable duels. People were just fetching basics. And so then they were just like pretty good dual lands.
Yeah, exactly.
And so people still played a bunch of tapped tricolor lands, etc., to make up for the fact. that they needed hit their colors.
Yeah, back in the day when the tricolor lands didn't have basic land types on them, so you couldn't fetch them.
Yeah, that's true. They didn't.
Yeah, but once Battle for Zendikar came out, and it added the...
and everybody played 4 colors.
Yeah, I can't remember what people call... Did people call them Tango lands? Was that the name of it?
People tried to suggest Tango lands. They tried to suggest either Starbucks lands was a suggestion. I think they ended up just being called Battle lands.
Yeah, so these were the dual lands that had basic land types on them, but they entered play tapped unless you had two or more basics in play, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't...
So it's pretty common in the like Mardu green decks to fetch Plains Swamp, and then you would get an untapped red-green duel.
Yeah, exactly.
Man, I miss those decks. Dark Jeskai, also a ton of fun.
Yeah. So we've talked about this article a little bit already, but if you want to find this article by Frank Karsten, it's called "How Many Colored Mana Sources Do You Need to Consistently Cast Your Spells?" The most recent update was October 10th, 2018. You can just Google that title and you'll find it. I'll also link
I just Googled Frank Karsten mana and it pops up.
Yeah.
So it's pretty well known.
I'll link to it in the description of the podcast and also in the description for the YouTube video if you're watching there. So,
and I guess one more caveat with this case study we're about to do and with this Frank Karsten article, different decks in different formats will have different subtle timing needs. They may have different amounts of untapped land needs. You might have, who knows? So as closely as you follow these guidelines to build your preliminary mana base, it's probably going to be fairly good, but you should always be open to tuning things based on play patterns and adjusting from there.
Exactly.
So we won't have done that with these 2 decks that we're about to come up with mana bases for.
Yeah.
So if you want to take them for a spin, there might be some minor changes you need.
Exactly. So let's kick this case study off. We're going to start things off with Mardu Godpharaoh's Gift. So you can pull up your deck list here if you're following along on Twitter or if you're watching on YouTube. Hello. So general idea of this deck. We're a Gate to the Afterlife Godpharaoh's Gift deck. We have Crypt Breaker, Stitcher Supplier, and Bowmat Courier as our 1-drops. Our 2-drops are Seasoned Hallowblade, Mire Triton, and 2 copies of Fiend Artisan. We have 4 Skyclave Apparition, 4 Combat Celebrant in the 3-drop slot alongside our Gate to the Afterlife. We have 2 Angel of Invention in a 5-drop slot, and then the 2 Godpharaoh's Gift up top. So this is a total of 36 cards. So our mana base is going to be 24 lands. So notable...
Oh, yeah, that's the other thing I forgot to mention. I think most people agree at this point. If you're playing aggro / something slightly more aggressive, it's usually 23, 24. Mid-range decks have around 25, 26. And I think most control decks now are like 27 plus lands, with Uro decks being an exception, going up to 30 sometimes just because of the put lands into play effect.
Exactly.
But the decks we've built here follow that rule. And it's just kind of, the slower you want to play, the more lands you need.
Yeah, specifically for this one, we kind of want to be able to hit 5 lands on turn 5 because going Gate into Sacrifice Gate is a pretty good sequence for a deck like this. So it might even be right to play more lands, but realistically, this deck only curves out to it, like its curve ends at 3 because we're not really ever looking to actually cast a Godpharaoh's Gift, hard cast it, or really hard cast an Angel of Invention either. It's nice if we could, if the opportunity comes up, but we're really just looking to, mill those or discard them. So 24 lands is what we've settled on.
Yeah.
So
first thing I noticed looking at this list is that there's like basically no red. It would be nice to be able to have a red around to crack Bowmat Courier, but I'm not going to consider it as a requirement for a 1-drop. Combat Celebrant also doesn't really need to be cast. There might be games where we're discarding it in order to get creatures in the bin or just because we're going to be able to reanimate it. So the red is very, very minor. I might consider this as needing a single red on 3, probably instead going to consider it as needing a single red on turn 4, and therefore, probably only need to play like 8 or 9 red sources mixed into our other duels.
Yeah. So like we mentioned already, we're gonna start off by just looking at all the dual lands we have access to and then going from there. So if we start with just our shock lands, we have our Blood Crypts, we have our Sacred Foundries, we have our Godless Shrine. We can't ignore our Triomes since they kind of make things a little bit easier. But also, while the Triome here would do lots for making sure we fix our mana, this is not really a deck where we want our lands early to come into play tapped. So most likely, if we can make it work with color requirements, we're going to be trimming on those.
Yeah, and this is a deck that you're kind of aggressive and you have this combo finish. So yeah, as much as we said sort of consider all the duels, I think it's somewhat fair to like trim back on Savaya Triomes and off the bat say that we're not going to play temples because we probably pretty realistically need to go 1, 2, 3. So it makes me want to lean into Shock Check, which is a mana base that can pretty consistently be always untapped.
Exactly, yeah. So let's pull in all of our options for Shock Check. We have Clifftop Retreats for red-white. We have Isolated Chapels for black-white. And we have Dragon Skull Summit for black-red. And then the other lands we will want to consider here, of course, are pathways. So we have Bright Climb Pathway, and then we have our Needle Verge Pathway. And then finally, Kaladesh also added our fast lands. So we have Inspiring Vantage for red-white, and we have Concealed Courtyard for black-white. Now, this could be a deck where these fast lands are actually pretty good because we want to be casting our Stitcher Supplier, our Crypt Breaker on turn 1. Notably, though, our color requirements for turn 1, Bomat Courier is easy. We can cast it with whatever. But all of our 1-drops are black. So if I was looking to be playing a fast land, I would automatically kind of rule out Inspiring Vantage off the bat for that reason, because it doesn't cast our Crypt Breakers or our Stitcher Supplier. And looking at our 2-drops as well, we have 2 Fiend Artisan, 2 Mire Triton, 4 Seasoned Talonblade. Our Courtyard can cast all of those cards, whereas the Vantage doesn't contribute to our color requirements for at all for Fiend Artisan. And while it can cast a Seasoned Talonblade, it doesn't help us with black for Mire Triton. So I already kind of want to rule out Inspiring Vantage as an option, but we'll just leave it here for now so we can take a look at everything we have here.
Yeah, we're basically, a black-white deck that plays up to turn 3. So I feel like it's pretty safe to just keep all the black-white duels and see how many lands we have.
All right. So we'll start with how many color, since red is our thing we think we can kind of skimp out on because really we need one source for Bomat Courier a bit later, and then Combat Settlement we're not really worried about. I think 9 or 10 sources we can get away with. So we already have 8 starting off with our shock lands, Sacred Foundry and Blood Crypt. Now, our deck is essentially base black-white, so that automatically makes me want to trim on Dragon Skull Summits because I'd rather my red source also produce white. And Dragon Skull Summit, in particular, it doesn't help us cast those turn 1 Crypt Breakers or Stitcher Suppliers, right? Yeah.
Would we rather trim Dragon Skull than Clifftop? Well, I think our black requirements are a bit stricter.
It's going to come down to how important is the white, right?
Okay, here, what's this as like a first idea? What if we don't play Sacred Foundry, but we play Inspiring Vantage? So we play Godless Shrine, Blood Crypt, Concealed Courtyard, Inspiring Vantage, Bright Climb Pathway, Isolated Chapel. How many lands is that? Because now this is base black-white. We have 8 red sources. Our red sources can always enter untapped if needed. The Isolated Chapels might be a bit suspect here. They might be entering tapped a bit too often because we don't actually have that many mountains or maybe just playing the Sacred Foundry over Inspiring Vantage is better to get the Isolated Chapels untapped.
This is something I wanted to make note of as well. I think specifically because we want to play a couple check lands, it would be better to make the easy swap out for Sacred Foundry instead of Inspiring Vantage so we can up the amount of sources we have to make sure Isolated Chapel does enter play untapped. So looking at this mana base here, 4 Bright Climb Pathway, 4 Courtyard, 4 Godless Shrine, 4 Chapel, 4 Blood Crypt, 4 Sacred Foundry. That leaves us at 24 lands. So if we're looking for our colored sources on turn 1 for a Stitcher Supplier for black, we have 4, 8, 12 pathway counts. So we'll count it as 16, but it's only kind of half.
Yeah, even if you count it as 2, we're at 14, which is what Frank Carson recommends. So I think we're good for turn 1 black. We're almost certainly good for turn 2 white. Double black on 2, though, to cast Fiend Artisan. We want 20 black sources.
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little bit hairy. We actually have 20 if you assume Bright Climb Pathway is a black source. The problem is because it's a pathway, it's not actually both. So I would only count it as half. So we're a little short on that. So we'd be at 18 instead of 20. But I kind of think that might be okay in this scenario because it's not like we're playing 4 Fiend Artisan, and it's not really the end of the world if we have to cast it on turn 3.
That's true. I mean, the other thing we could do, like we kind of built this to avoid a lot of tap lands, but we could also like maybe cut 2 Sacred Foundries for 2 Savai Triomes.
Yeah, that would also solve our problem as well.
Because then, yeah, that keeps the number of red and white sources all the same, shores up the black sources a little bit more. It's a tap land, but, you know, maybe we can find room for it. Maybe we don't have a 1-drop. That's going to happen sometimes. We can go tap land into black source and cast the Fiend Artisan. And even if it's disrupting our curve a bit, maybe the cycling is something that's useful later. This is the sort of thing that in play patterns, like if this card's too awkward, then you go back.
Exactly. So the Triome gets us to those 20 sources for Fiend Artisan if we're counting the Bright Climb Pathway as half. For red, we're sitting at 8 sources for
I think that's about
basically Bowmat Courier, and like we're kind of not really counting Combat Celebrant, right? So I think 8 sources is okay. And then when we're looking at white, our main concern is can we cast Skyclave Apparition on turn 3 the majority of the time? So we want to have somewhere around 18 sources. So right now, I'm still going to count Bright Climb Pathway as half.
I mean, this is symmetric in black and white, right? So isn't it? Or is there slightly more black?
I think there's slightly more black. If we're looking at white, we have 4 down here, 4 with the Foundries and the Triomes, 8, 12, 16, and then count
18.
Pathway as 2. So that's 18.
Yeah, so that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, that's bang on from what we would want. So really, we could just go with this.
Yeah, so the only thing, so we're pretty good on black and white. The Combat Celebrant, like we're a bit light on red. So if we could find some way to fit in more red sources, I would be interested, but I'm not sure we can do that without disrupting our other colors. Because to not disrupt black or white, we would need more tri-lands. I guess you could do something like play some basics and Fabled Passage, and the Fabled Passage will count as triple, but then your basics only count as 1, and you're introducing more tap lands, which I think is not what this deck wants.
Yeah, Fabled Passage obviously is a consideration here, but the problem with Fabled Passage is it requires I
don't think it is a consideration.
If you are considering Fabled Passage, right? You have to think about how many basics you have to play. And with how restrictive some of the mana costs in this deck, I don't really think you can afford to do it. As well as with our deck essentially curving out at 3, we don't want more lands that come into play tapped on turn 1, 2, and 3. We're already stretching it kind of thin with 2 Savad Triomes, right? So I think Fabled Passage isn't something we really want to consider for a deck like this.
Yeah, I agree. Needing double white on 3, double black on 2 with red potentially, it doesn't really leave much room for basics or things like Fabled Passage, which ultimately is just a single colored source. Even these pathways are kind of a bit awkward. Changes that I might make here, or changes that I would keep in mind, like I think this is a good place to start, but changes I would keep in mind if I were going to play this deck is watching how often the isolated chapels are entering tapped. If it's relatively often, maybe you could go to like 3 chapels and play a 3rd Savai Triome to shore up the red, since they're going to be tapped kind of anyway. But if they're mostly entering untapped, then you can leave them.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah. Like one other change we could make here is we could turn, Bright Climb Pathway into 2 Dragon Skull Summits, and we could turn the other 2 into 2 Clifftop Retreats, right? And that gets us to our...
Yeah, it's counted the same, and it adds red sources.
It adds 4 red sources, and it's kind of counted the same. The only problem, though, by doing that is while we still have the same amount of black sources in our deck, I guess since we're only counting Bright Climb Pathway 4 copies as 2 black sources, it doesn't help us. It actually makes us slightly less consistent for casting a black card on turn 1.
That's true.
Because the Dragon Soul Summits enter play tapped on turn 1. So it's a pretty easy change we could make if we're worried about our red requirements. But we're giving up, like, the sacrifice we're making to make us a little bit more consistently to cast a combat celebrant on turn 3 is giving up our consistency for casting a black card on turn 1. And
I think the black cards are more important.
Considering what our game plan here is with a Mardu Godpharaoh's Gift deck, we want to cast our Cryptbreaker or our Stitcher Supplier on turn 1. It's way more important to do that than it is to cast a Combat Celebrant on turn 3, because we don't want to cast Combat Celebrant in most scenarios. We just want to discard it or mill it. So while we are technically by the numbers a little bit short on our red, in the grand scheme of things, I think this is a scenario where it's okay to make a sacrifice there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so this is how we would throw together our mana base. If you're listening for the podcast, we have 4 Concealed Courtyards, 4 Godless Shrines, 4 Isolated Chapels, 4 Bright Climb Pathway. It's 4 Blood Crypt, 2 Sacred Foundries, 2 Savage Triumphs. And that's kind of how we would do it. So if you did the case study before, take a look at your mana base, compare it to ours, listen to our reasoning, see how we did it. If you did something a little bit different or have actually thought about a way to do it better, tweet at us at DWC Podcast 1. Shoot us a message on Twitter, Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, link it in the comments, because I'd actually be really interested to discuss if you found a way to do it better. But I actually like our reasoning here for this one.
Yeah, and that's my general pattern. Like, based on archetype and curve considerations, what type of duels do I want? And then balancing those duels for color.
Exactly, yeah. So let's change things up here and move to our next deck for our case study. I think this one's going to be a little more difficult because the mana costs in this deck are kind of all over the place.
All right, this deck is great. A brief overview of this deck. I played Saheeli a lot in Standard even after Felidar Guardian got banned, so I was just feeling nostalgic. And I was trying to think of interesting ways to use Saheeli, which let me searching through the creatures for things with ETBs. And I realized you could use Burning Tree Emissary. That if you don't have to cast the Burning Tree Emissary, you just copy it. It's basically 2 free mana. Which means if you copy a Burning Tree Emissary on turn 4, you have 6 mana. And there's nothing more worthwhile to do with 6 mana in Historic than cast Gearhulks. So that's what this deck is. It's got the food package to help ramp a bit. The Wicked Wolf was there just as like an analog to Ravenous Chupacabra, so that Saheeli could potentially be a removal spell.
Yeah, here. So I'll actually out for the listeners, anyone who isn't watching on YouTube, I'll list out the cards in this deck so you can kind of get an idea of how crazy it is. We have 4 Gilded Goose, 4 Burning Tree Emissary, 4 Scorching Dragonfire, 2 Abrade, 1 Tail's End, 1 Essence Scatter, 1 Supreme Will, 4 Saheeli Rai, 2 Glimmer of Genius, 4 Wicked Wolf, 2 Combustible Gearhulk, 2 Sublime Epiphany, and 3 Torrential Gearhulk. If you're kind of picturing these cards in your head as you're listening to it, you can kind of see that the mana requirements in this deck are all over the place. We have green on 1. We have green-red hybrid ×2 on turn 2. We have blue-red 1 on 3, green-green 2 on 4, red-red 4, blue-blue 4 on 6. It's all over the place.
All right, so I admit and I acknowledge that it looks all over the place at first, but what I want to point out okay, is the following. To cast Gilded Goose on 1, you need a lot of green sources. Burning Tree Emissary is double Gruul hybrid, so that also kind of requires a lot of green sources. And Wicked Wolf has a lot of green sources. And these are sort of the permanents you'll be casting early. The removal spells, the counter magic, which are red and blue, even though they're 2 CMC, you can kind of sometimes afford to wait. And then the Sublime Epiphany and the Gear Hulks are 6 mana. And so the fact that they're double colored is a lot less impactful because you have more time to find more lands to hit those requirements. So the idea then is going to be to play a bunch of green-based duels so that ideally on turn 2, we have like a green-red duel and a green-blue duel, unlocking our blue cards, our red cards, and all these double green cards. So I think, yeah, it looks all over the place, but if you have a green-centered mana base within blue and red kind of as feature colors, you can sort of just build a blue-red mana base that happens to have a lot of green in it, where that will work out for this.
Yeah, and also something to consider here is while we have 4 Gilded Goose, our curve technically just starts on 2, and it's not really the end of the world if we don't cast a Gilded Goose on turn 1. So when we're considering something like a Temur Triome for a deck like this, I'd be a lot happier to play 4 copies of the Triome because of how all over the place our mana costs are in this deck in particular, because not only do we have less green 1-drops on turn 1, but it also doesn't really matter if we cast it on turn 1 as compared to the Mardu deck, where in pretty much every game, we always want to cast a 1-drop on turn 1. So starting off here, I'm pretty much always just going to add 4 Ketria Triome to the deck.
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing is because this deck is a bit inconsistent, to help with that, we probably want some scry lands. Since we're playing 26 lands in this case, I think 5 or 6 tap lands is fine. So I probably want like a couple green-based scry lands.
Yeah, scry lands would definitely be a consideration in this deck for all those reasons you said. Whereas, well, we didn't even consider them in our last deck because we want to curve out on the first 3 turns. So starting here, we have the 4 Triomes. And we're going to pull all of our Shockland possibilities out. So our 4 Steam Vents, our 4 Stomping Grounds, our 4 Breeding Pools. Let's take some Temples over here. Let's pull just 2 of each color combination into the mana base just so we have them here to look at.
Sure.
Let's consider our check lands. So our 4 Hinterland Harbors. We have our Sulphur Falls. And then our green ones, which are...
Rootbound Crag,
yeah. Okay.
This is also a deck where I think we're fine. Because we're playing more lands, we're playing 2 extra lands, we have room for some Fabled Passage basics. And because this deck is playing later, up until turn 4, 5, 6, late game Fabled Passage allows you, like, maybe you've drawn mana that's fine, but you're missing, like, a second blue source. Fabled Passage allows you to shore up these color requirements you may need for your, like, 4 and 6 drops.
Yeah, we'll add 1 copy of every basic into the deck that we could possibly want and build from there. So 1 forest, 1 island, 1 mountain, and then adjust the numbers based on that.
So already, because of these Burning Tree Emissaries, we want a lot of green and red sources. So, I mean, every one of these lands can make green or red. So we're like automatically good there. So then what we're kind of trying to balance is, I think, do we have enough green sources for Goose? And we're considering that we're fine casting it on turn 2, which means we only need like 13 sources.
Exactly, yeah. So we're looking at a total land count in this deck of 26. It could be right to play more than that, but we're just going to consider 26 to start. I think the 4 Triome, 4 Breeding Pool, 4 Stomping Ground, 4 Steam Vents are probably all going to be are all going to stay the same. The only thing that might not be 4 copies is the Steam Vents, I could say. Because Steam Vents doesn't contribute to that turn 1 Gilded Goose.
Because they're not turn 1 green. And also this type of deck, like, it's pretty greedy in what it's trying to pull off, casting Burning Trees and sometimes like just naked Saheelis. So it's a deck that might lose if it has to shock itself too much. So I'm also a bit hesitant to play, because we have no life gain, to play 12 shocks.
Yeah, so for the reason I already mentioned, let's just start by trimming 2 Steam Vents. And then...
the next thing is, I think we probably don't want 6 temples. I think we maybe want 1 or 2.
And for the reasons you already mentioned that we talked about with steam vents, I think we'd more likely lean towards our green duels. So Temple of Epiphany is kind of is one we're going to cut for now. So we have 2 Temple of Mystery, 2 Temple of Abandon. And you said you only wanted to play 2. So are we...
Probably, I don't know, just go like 1 and 1.
We'll start with 1 and 1, and then we can adjust that based on what our color requirements are as we get more down. So if we're looking at just the lands that we have, considered for the main deck right now, which is this pile here, which is the 4 Triomes, our 10 shock lands, and then 1 copy of Temple of Mystery, 1 copy of Temple of Abandon. Looking at green, this is 9, 10, 14. So 14 sources gets us to our color requirements for our Gilded Goose.
1, 2, yeah. If we could fit in a bit more, that would be nice. And I think we can if we play the Fabled Passage in some forests. But for Goose on 2, we're kind of already there.
Yeah, Goose on 2, we're there. It's actually good enough for Goose on 1 as well, but we're considering our tap lands as turn 1 green sources, which you can't really do. So
yeah. So the tap lands don't really count. So for Goose on 1, we only have 8, so we would like a few more if possible.
Yeah, looking at our requirements for our Wicked Wolf, which is our next kind of really restrictive green card, we would want to have around 16 sources. So we're too short there. So we have to try and make that up with either Fabled Passage or some of our check lands here.
So as long as we make sure that we can cast Gilded Goose consistently kind of early, we can count the 4 Gilded Goose as 1 or 2 tricolor sources as well, because it is a mana dork.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
So
right now with this core here, we are sitting at 16 lands. So we have room for 10 more. So we can shore up our green with some basics and with the Fabled Passage if we want to go there.
Yeah, I think, what if we start with like 3 Fabled Passage, 1 island, 1 mountain, 2 forest? You want to have enough basics when you're playing Passage that they don't become dead draws late game. I think 5 is safe, but we can start at 4.
It's only 3 Fabled Passage, so I think that's okay. And then, so the forests get us up to our requirements on their own, and then the Fabled Passage just kind of give us some extra wiggle room there. Yeah. So out of our 10 remaining lands, these 7 that we've added leaves us with 3 to work with.
I think we're good on color requirements now, all across the curve. Saheeli, for 2, I guess it's 1 and a color and 1 and a color. So for Saheeli on 3, we want about 11 red and 11 blue. I think we're there pretty easily.
Looking at red right now, it'd be 4, 5, 12, plus 3 Fabled Passage.
Yeah. So I think we're actually good on all of our color requirements now with these duels and the Fabled Passage basics plan without any of our check lands. So with 3 extra slots for lands now, we could shore up some of our colors with these harbors. But I think this is maybe a good example. All of our color requirements are good. Our number of tap lands to untap lands seems fine. And so I actually played this deck for a few hours on ladder one day, trying to see if I would make it work. And it can't really deal with the crawling barons. And maybe some castles on the opposing sides might be annoying. And since our color requirements are so good, we can play like a Field of Ruin.
That's actually interesting. So we have 3 slots left. So if we want to add Field of Ruin in.
Yeah, just 1. Like, as much as our color requirements are satisfied here, the deck is still pretty color heavy. It does interfere a lot with Burning Tree Emissary. It might actually mess up some draws pretty badly. So I don't want to play any more than 1 colorless land. But I think it's something that you can safely mix in. And then for our other cards, I mean, most of our deck is green. I think our green sources are quite good. I don't know. We could play like 2 green checks, maybe. I don't know. I think it's pretty open.
Yeah, I think for the same reasons that we already talked about earlier, we probably just won't want to Sulfur Falls.
Or maybe these last 2 slots should be some dual face land. It doesn't really matter what, so long as it's useful because our colors are good. So maybe they should be like Shatter Skull Smashing. All right. Now, well, okay. Maybe we don't want to do this because now the Smashings are considered part of the mana base. And so if you ever cast them, okay, when you do this, I guess it's just good to keep in mind that like it's a land first before it's a spell, whereas in a lot of decks, it's a spell first that could be a land if needed. So you're looking to have them as like a late game option, but you should be willing to play it early if needed.
Yeah. So looking at this, like we could have also gone a different way with the mana base. Like we didn't have to play the Fabled Passage with the basics. We could have played more check lands if we wanted to do that, or just not played Fabled Passage, played check lands. So I guess something to consider here with this 3-color deck is I do like having access to basics because there are decks in the format that, might Field of Ruin us at some point, whereas our color requirements are kind of spread out across our curve more than they were in the last deck with Mardu, where in Mardu we didn't play any basic lands, but our color requirements were a little more tight for the early turn, so we couldn't really afford to do that. Mm-hmm. Whereas this deck, there's a lot more. While kind of on the surface it seems like our mana requirements might be a little bit harder because they're more all over the place, because we have more expensive cards in our deck, it actually makes things a little bit easier and we can be a little bit more loose with things.
Yeah, the color requirements for expensive cards are easier to hit. And we're just playing 2 extra lands because our deck is more expensive, which gives us a bunch of room as well.
Yeah, so now with how we've settled, our mana base is 2 Steam Vents, 4 Stomping Grounds, 4 Breeding Pools, 4 Ketria Triome, 1 Temple of Mystery, 1 Temple of Abandon, 1 Field of Ruin, 3 Fabled Passage, 2 Forest, 1 Mountain, 1 Island, and then 2 Shatter Skull Smashing as a modal double face land. This brings us in for green sources at 19 technical sources. I'm not going to count Field of Ruin as a source. For blue, brings us in at 15 sources. And then for red, it brings us in at 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 sources. So more green than everything else. And then our blue and our red are tied.
And that's about what we were aiming for. Things to keep in mind if you take this for a spin and want to maybe make some changes. Despite the Field of Ruin not interfering with the number of color requirements, if it interferes with the color requirements in your curve too often, just like scrap it. It's not as important as hitting your colors.
And I actually miscounted too, because for red, it's actually 2 more. It's 17 because I didn't count Shatter Skull Smashing.
Oh, yeah.
Which actually works out in our benefit as well, because we have more red cards on turn 2 than we have blue. So going, green, red, blue from most sources to least actually works in our favor.
Yeah, sweet.
So yeah, this is how we would build it if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast, you can check it out. I'll tweet our lists out as well, what we did for the case study. It'll probably be in the thread for the original post, so you can see where we landed off, or you can just watch the YouTube video if you're interested in the process. And yeah, actually, this was fun. I like this whole case study approach for...
just doing it off the cuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a summary, come up with a list of the duels that you might want to play. If you want to play tap duels, if you don't want to play tap duels, etc. And then balance for color.
Exactly. So yeah, if like I said, for the Mardu list, if you came up with something different for the teamer list and think your mana base is a little bit better, leave it in the YouTube comments, tweet at us, send us a message. Happy to discuss anything. And like Cam also talked about earlier, while, theoretically for both these decks, the mana bases work for color requirements, you're also going to learn more by actually playing the decks. So as you get games in, you'll notice things about the mana base that you won't notice just from, this perspective of throwing it together in a deck list. So you can make adjustments based on how the mana base plays out from there. Mm-hmm. Just because you started with this build doesn't mean you're hard locked into these choices.
Yeah, for sure. And these numbers coming from the Frank Carson article are based on you should be able to cast your cards whatever percentage of the time. And it's assuming that that's equally important for all decks and all cards. Maybe you're an aggro deck that is so aggressive that you have absolutely no late game. And if you don't cast your 3-drop on 3, it's not good enough on turn 4. Then obviously you need to go above the color requirements from this article. And those are things you'll notice as you play.
Yeah, exactly. All right, and that's going to wrap things up for us this week. Thank you all for joining the club. Make sure, as always, check out wizardtower.com for all your Magic single needs. If you want to support the show, you can find us on Patreon, Twitch, YouTube. Subscribe to our stuff. We appreciate all the support. And however you listen to the show, whether it's Podbean, iTunes, any podcast app, leave a review, rate the podcast, share it with your friends. Everything helps, keeps this thing growing and bringing to new listeners. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you guys next week.